You're listening to the story titled, Cowboy Risked His Life for a Native Boy. What happened next changed the entire valley. It's a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the unlikely bond that turned enemies into allies, set in the unforgiving lands of the Old West. This is where one man's choice sparked a movement and earned him a family he never expected. Ezra Whitlock had spent most of his adult life trying to stay out of trouble. On the outskirts of a fading frontier town, he tended to his fence line with worn hands and a quiet heart. He wasn't the man he used to be, not since his wife passed, and the fever took his son. These days, Ezra just wanted peace. That peace shattered with 3 sharp gunshots that cracked through the valley like thunder. Ezra froze, one gloved hand gripping rusted wire. Gunfire in these parts didn't come without reason, and it was rarely a good one. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowed against the dust kicked up beyond the pines. Whatever was coming, it was fast. And it wasn't cattle. The pounding of hooves echoed closer, followed by angry shouts. Then, from the tree line, a figure burst into view, a boy no older than 12, his long black hair streaming behind him, blood trickling down his temple. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stumbled over rocks and sagebrush. Ezra recognized the cut of his clothes. He was native, likely from the northern valleys. Behind him, 4 riders emerged in pursuit. Ezra recognized the lead rider immediately. Colt Brennan, a mercenary with a cruel reputation. Brennan had haunted 3 counties with his brand of justice for hire. If he was chasing the boy, it wasn't for anything noble. The boy tripped, fell hard, and screamed in pain, his leg folding awkwardly beneath him. Brennan and his men slowed their horses, surrounding the child like wolves circling a wounded deer. Ezra glanced toward his house, barely 100 yards away. His rifle was leaning by the door. He could make it if he ran, but not in time. The boy wouldn't survive that long. He looked back toward the child. Something flickered in Ezra's chest, a flicker he hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was the way the boy looked at him. Desperate, hopeless, familiar. As Brennan raised his rifle, Ezra did something that surprised even himself. He stepped out from behind the fence post. "That's far enough," he said, voice steady and clear. All 4 gunmen turned their eyes toward him. Brennan lowered his rifle, but not by much. A smirk crept across his scarred face. "Well, if it isn't Ezra Whitlock. Thought you'd vanished into your shack for good," Brennan drawled. "This ain't your business, hermit." Ezra took another step forward, hands still empty. "The boy hasn't done anything that warrants being gunned down like a dog. He's a thief," one of Brennan's men spat. "Stole 3 prime horses from the Morrison ranch." Ezra looked at the boy, who'd managed to sit up despite the pain. There was blood on his brow, but his eyes were clear. "They belong to my father," the boy said, his voice calm despite the situation. "Morrison stole them from us last winter. I was only taking them back." Ezra felt the truth in the boy's words. Morrison had a reputation: land grabs, livestock disappearing from native camps. It wasn't theft, it was reclamation. Brennan's smile hardened. "Doesn't matter what he says. Morrison wants his horses back and he's paying for results." Ezra stepped closer. "Even if that means shooting a child." Brennan's rifle lifted again, slow and deliberate. "It is when I say it is." Ezra knew he was outgunned. For 2-1. No weapon, no chance. But sometimes, war teaches a man not how to survive, but how to stand. "You boys ride on," Ezra said, voice like stone. "This doesn't have to end badly." "Oh, but it already has," Brennan replied. That was the moment the boy, his name was Ayana, Ezra would later learn, dragged himself beside Ezra, not behind, beside, as if ready to face the bullet too. "You don't have to do this," the boy whispered. "I know," Ezra replied, "but I will." Then came the sound no one expected, a whisper of wind. And an arrow. The arrow came so fast it was almost invisible until it struck Colt Brennan's shoulder with a dull, wet thud. He let out a howl and tumbled backward off his horse, his rifle flung into the dirt. His horse reared and galloped away, Pandemonium broke loose. The other 3 riders spun their mounts, shouting, searching the ridge for whoever had fired. But they couldn't see anyone, just trees and shadows. Then a second arrow hissed through the air, narrowly missing another man's head. A third arrow struck the ground between a horse's front legs, sending the animal reeling in terror. Ezra stood frozen, scanning the tree line. Whoever was up there had the high ground, the timing, and deadly precision. The boy beside him didn't flinch. In fact, Ayanna stood straighter, eyes locked on the horizon. Brennan writhed on the ground, clutching his bleeding shoulder. "Get me out of here," he rasped, but his men were already gone, spooked, outnumbered, fleeing toward the pines. One of them glanced back only once before vanishing into the dust. "Wait, don't leave me," Brennan screamed after them, but the only answer was the wind. Ezra remained still, watching the ridge, then movement. 50 yards up the slope, a figure stepped out from behind a boulder. Then another, and another. Each wore earth-toned clothing that melted into the wilderness. Each carried a bow, an arrow already drawn. They moved with grace, silence, and control. Ezra had seen soldiers in the war, but nothing like this. At the front of the group was a woman with long braids streaked with gray. Her eyes were sharp as obsidian, her presence commanding. Ayanna's voice broke with emotion. "Mother, so this was her, the one who had raised Ayanna to speak clearly, to fight back, to stand tall and when hunted." She walked toward Brennan, who was crawling toward his fallen rifle. Without a word, she stepped on the weapon, pinning it beneath her boot. "You hunt children," she said in perfect English, her voice low and unforgiving. "In our land, men who hunt children don't live long." Brennan looked up, sweat pouring from his face. "I was just doing my job. Morrison paid me." The woman spat the name. "That snake owes us more than horses." Then she turned toward Ezra. Her eyes studied him, not with suspicion, but with weight, trying to read the entire measure of the man who had stood between guns and her child. "You stood for my son," she said. Ezra nodded. Seemed like the right thing to do. She looked to Ayanna, who was limping but upright. Her hands moved gently over his injured leg. "Not broken," she murmured. "But you'll be resting for a while." The boy looked at Ezra. You were ready to die for me." "Wasn't planning on it," Ezra replied. "Just figured someone had to say enough." The woman rose again. "You understand what you've done." "I interfered with a hired killer," Ezra said, "and probably got myself a target on the back." She didn't smile, but there was something like respect in her eyes. "You saved the grandson of Running Bear." Ezra's heart stopped. Running Bear. The name echoed across the territory like a storm warning. A legendary chief of the northern tribes, a strategist, a leader. A man who could rally 200 warriors with a single word. Morrison didn't just steal horses, she said. He stole from Running Bear's bloodline. "And now, because of you, his grandson lives." Brennan moaned softly, his body limp in the dirt. One of the warriors stepped forward, tied his hands behind his back, and retrieved his weapons. "What do you plan to do with him?" Ezra asked. She didn't answer directly. "That depends on what Running Bear decides when he hears what happened today." Ayanna stepped beside her again. "You think Morrison will come after us?" Another warrior appeared, speaking rapidly in their language. The woman's face darkened. "They've gone straight to Morrison's ranch," she said. "They'll tell him everything." Ezra felt the weight of that truth sink into his chest. Morrison would know before sunset. His men had failed, the boy had survived, and a settler had intervened. He would not take that lightly. "If Morrison's smart," Ezra said, "he'll be gone by tonight." The woman's mouth curled into something close to a smirk. "Morrison is many things. Smart isn't one of them. He'll send more men," Ezra said grimly. "Armed, angry, ready to finish what Brennan started." She nodded. "He won't let you live." Ezra exhaled. "Then I guess I need to prepare." "You can't do this alone," she said, her voice firm. "I've been alone for a long time," Ezra replied. Ayanna stepped forward, his voice steady despite the pain in his leg. In our tribe, when you save the life of Chief's blood, you become family. Ezra was quiet for a long time. He thought of the empty cabin, the ghosts of his wife and son, the long nights with no voices but his own, and now, here was a boy he never met, a warrior mother, a tribe that fought with silence and shadows. Family protects family, Ayanna said simply. Ezra looked north toward the hills, toward whatever was coming, then he nodded. Let's make our stand. Ezra's cabin wasn't much, just a humble structure tucked in a natural hollow surrounded by low hills on 3 sides and a narrow creek on the 4th. He'd chosen the spot for its solitude, not strategy, but now, with Morrison likely sending men with rifles and hate, that solitude was the only thing working in their favor. He stood at the edge of the property, scanning the horizon as Ayanna rode behind one of the warriors and Brennan, wounded and groaning, was dragged between Naali and another tribesman. The war party moved quietly, wasting no time. How many rounds you got? Naali asked as they approached the cabin. Enough for a short fight, Ezra replied. Not enough for a siege. Then we make it short, she said. Inside the cabin, Ezra retrieved his old Winchester rifle, polished but rarely fired since the war. He checked the ammunition and handed spare rounds to 2 of Naali's warriors, who nodded silently. They moved with the grace of people used to surviving against the odds. Ayanna sat near the window, resting his injured leg. He looked small in Ezra's home, but his eyes held the seriousness of a soldier. I can still shoot, the boy said. Ezra knelt beside him. You've already done more than enough. You just stay sharp. From the ridge to the east came the low rumble of hooves, steady. Many. Ezra moved to the front window. They're coming. Naali joined him. How many? 9. Maybe 10, Ezra answered. And Morrison's riding in front. The name made the air colder. Morrison was the kind of man who built his empire, not with hard work, but with blood. He'd stolen land from native families and paid men like Brennan to silence opposition. He moved through the law like smoke, untouchable, uncatchable. Until now. Ezra took a deep breath. He's not going to talk. No, Naali agreed. He's coming to finish what he started. The sound of hooves grew louder. Dust rose behind their riders as they slowed just out of rifle range. Morrison dismounted. He was a thick-set man with a trim beard and a cold gaze that looked more suited for hanging judges than dusty ranches. He stepped forward, hands on his belt. Whitlock, he called, this ain't your fight. Give me the boy, and we can all walk away. Ezra stepped into the doorway, rifle resting casually in his arms but clearly loaded. You've got the wrong place for deals, Morrison. Morrison chuckled, shaking his head. You're a fool. 9 guns against what, 3? 4, if you count that savage child. Naali had moved to the rear window, scanning the tree line. Ezra followed her gaze and saw it. At first, nothing. Then, faint shadows among the pines. Then movement, dozens of mounted warriors, ghost-like, silent, shadows made flesh. Naali's voice was almost reverent. They came. Ezra nodded. Running Bear, Morrison called again. Last chance, Whitlock, but it was already too late. One by one, the warriors of Running Bear emerged from the woods, circling behind Morrison's men like spirits from another world. There were at least 50 of them, every rider armed, every movement disciplined. Ezra stepped out, rifle still in hand. Looks like we've got more than 4. Morrison turned, realized he was surrounded, and for the first time, fear cracked his polished exterior. Then the chief rode forward. Running Bear's presence was unmistakable. Broad-shouldered, silent, eyes like polished stone, his horse moved, like it understood the gravity of the moment. Morrison, the chief called out. We meet at last. Morrison's face paled. This is a misunderstanding. Running Bear's voice cut like a blade. Yes. Let's talk about misunderstandings. Like the horses you stole, the land you fenced, the child you tried to kill. Ezra, he's no one. A hermit who stuck his nose in where it didn't belong. Running Bear's gaze turned to Ezra, steady and unreadable. Then, slowly, he dismounted. The warriors closed the circle around Morrison and his men. Ezra stepped forward too. To men. Two worlds, one choice, real-world echo. This scene echoes true Western history more than fiction. Across North America, peaceful alliances often emerged between settlers and native tribes, but they were never without cost. Settlers who stood up for tribal justice became marked men. Yet those same men sometimes became symbols of something greater than the law, symbols of honor. Running Bear walked directly to Ezra. His eyes searched the older man's face. "You have seen war," he said. "More than I wanted," Ezra replied. "And yet, today, you chose to see more. You chose to act." Ezra nodded. "Someone had to." Running Bear looked back at Morrison, then at the boy, Ayanna. He took a deep breath and said something in his native tongue. One of his warriors brought forward a small leather pouch. Inside was a single eagle feather, wrapped in silver wire. He handed it to Ezra. "This," Running Bear said, "is the mark of honor. You are not just a friend, you are family." Ezra looked at the feather and felt something deep shift inside him. He'd spent so many years alone. Now, he belonged somewhere again. Morrison, still defiant, muttered, "This isn't over," but he was already backing away, his men retreating with lowered heads. "Oh, yes," Running Bear said. "It is." Morrison's men rode off slowly, boxed in by Running Bear's warriors like cattle being herded out of sacred ground. No one raised a rifle, but the message was clear: step out of line. And this ends differently. Ezra watched them go, his Winchester still in hand, the weight of the feather heavier than any weapon he'd ever carried. The silver-wrapped eagle plume wasn't just a token, it was a statement. He wasn't a bystander anymore. He had chosen a side. Running Bear turned to him and placed a hand on his shoulder. The old warrior's grip was firm, grounding. "Tonight," he said, "my people will dance in your honor. And by tomorrow, every tribe from these mountains to the plains will know the name Ezra Whitlock." Ezra blinked at that. For years, he had faded into solitude, but in a matter of hours, that had changed. He wasn't sure if he'd earned such respect. All he knew was that he hadn't been able to walk away when it counted. Naali stepped forward, her bow now slung across her back. She looked from Ezra to her son. "Ayanna, he saved you," she said simply. Ayanna nodded. "I wouldn't be here if not for him." The boy looked at Ezra with a kind of reverence, and for the first time in years, Ezra saw not just loss in the young boy's eyes, but hope. But the threat hadn't truly passed. From the edge of the forest, a warrior rode back, fast and out of breath. He spoke rapidly in their native tongue. Naali's expression darkened. "They're coming back," she said. "More riders, maybe 15, armed." Ezra frowned. Morrison didn't waste any time. He had backup ready. Running Bear said, voice like granite. He always meant to crush the boy, no matter the cost. "They'll be here before sunset." Naali added. Ezra looked toward the west, where the sky was already tinged with gold. He nodded slowly. "Then we prepare." The last stand they moved quickly. Running Bear's warriors split into teams, some hidden in the brush, others positioned along the ridge lines with clear sightlines toward the cabin. Ezra helped reinforce the windows with planks, cleared firing positions, and laid down extra rounds where they could be reached fast. Inside the cabin, Ayanna was given a bow and a place to hide, but the boy refused to sit idle. "I'm fighting," he said. "This is my land too." Ezra didn't argue. He'd seen enough war to know when a heart was ready for it. And Ayanna's heart beat like a drum. They lit small signal fires in distant brush, creating smoke that would mislead incoming riders. Naali's warriors laid false trails to confuse Morrison's men, drawing them toward the box canyon to the north, the very place Ezra had mentioned earlier. "Only one way in," Ezra had said. "Only one way out. Traps work both ways," Naali replied. Ezra admired her mind. Sharp, tactical. She wasn't just a mother, she was a fighter, a protector, and her people followed her without hesitation. As the sun dipped, hooves thundered again. Ezra stood on the porch of his cabin, rifle in hand, the feather tucked safely in his pocket. Dust rose on the eastern horizon. 15 riders, all armed, approached in tight formation. This wasn't a gang, it was an extermination squad. Morrison had paid well. These weren't rustlers. They were professionals. At their front was a man in a dark coat, different from the rest. He wore twin pistols and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. Ezra could feel it. This one was dangerous. The riders slowed as they approached the creek. The man in the dark coat raised a hand. "Ezra Whitlock," he called, "we've got no quarrel with you. But that boy's got to come with us." Ezra's voice rang back, calm but thunderous. "You come past this line, and we're all going to bleed." There was a pause. Then the man in the coat laughed, slow and bitter. "So be it." The first shots they advanced, but from the shadows of the canyon, arrows flew again, silent, swift, and deadly. Horses reared. Riders shouted. The plan was working. Running Bear's warriors moved like ghosts, vanishing and reappearing along the ridge line. The narrow terrain forced Morrison's reinforcements into a funnel. Gunfire erupted. Ezra fired his Winchester, downing a rider who had flanked too far left. Na Ellie, from a window, loosed arrows with terrifying accuracy. Inside the cabin, Ayanna watched the fight unfold with wide but determined eyes. "I can help," he said, voice tight. Ezra handed him a small sidearm. "If they get inside, use this." But only if. The battle outside roared. One by one, Morrison's men fell or retreated. But not without return fire. A bullet splintered the corner of Ezra's porch. Another nicked a warrior's shoulder. Then silence. Aftermath. Ezra stepped cautiously into the open. The sun had dipped behind the hills, bathing the land in shadows. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust. 3 of Morrison's men lay motionless. The rest were gone, scattered by the ambush and the warriors they couldn't match. Ezra looked up to find Running Bear standing beside him. "You fought like a man with nothing left to lose," the chief said. Ezra lowered his rifle. "I guess I found something worth fighting for." Running Bear nodded solemnly. "You've proven yourself twice over. My people will speak your name with honor." Na Ellie approached, her eyes tired but alert. "They'll be back again. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for weeks. But men like Morrison don't forget." Ezra looked to the north, where stars began to shine above the ridge. He thought of his cabin, his land, the boy he'd saved. "Then I won't either." That night, the drums began. Faint at first, just a soft rhythm carried on the wind. But, as the stars multiplied above the valley, the beat grew deeper, steadier, like the heartbeat of something ancient stirring awake from the pines and hills. Warriors gathered in a wide circle. Children peeked out from behind robes. Elders stood wrapped in silence, and women moved gracefully among them with faces painted in memory and gratitude. Ezra Whitlock stood among them, barefoot in the dirt, shirt torn, soot still on his hands. He felt out of place, unsure where to stand, unsure if he even belonged. But Na Ellie touched his arm and said quietly, "Tonight, you are one of us." It was the first time in years that Ezra didn't flinch from another person's touch. The celebration of a choice of celebration wasn't loud. It wasn't a victory march. It was something deeper, a quiet honoring of survival, of kinship forged in fire. Ayanna sat near the center, his leg bandaged but his spirit unshaken. Around him, warriors clapped, danced, and offered food and stories. Na Ellie stood tall beside Running Bear. She didn't need to speak much. Her presence spoke for her. As the night deepened, Running Bear called the circle to silence. He stepped into the center, holding the eagle feather Ezra had returned to him earlier. Only now, it was wrapped with a strip of red cloth and a knot of horsehair. Ceremonial and honored. "This man," Running Bear said, gesturing toward Ezra, "chose to stand when he could have stepped aside. Chose to protect when it would have been easier to look away. He did not act for glory, or for land, or for gold. He acted because he remembered what others forgot, that children are sacred. The warriors around the circle nodded in solemn agreement. Ezra swallowed hard. He had no words. Ayanna limped forward and placed the feather in Ezra's palm again. "Now it's yours," he said. This time, Ezra didn't hesitate. The fire within the days that followed. Word spread quickly. The white man who'd stood between a native boy and a gun. The settler who defied Morrison. The farmer who, without a single demand, earned the protection of an entire tribe. Stories, of course, changed in the telling. Some said Ezra was a former officer who'd once led a regiment through hell. Others said he was a ghost, a spirit rising from the earth to defend the innocent. Ezra didn't correct them. What mattered was the truth. He had made a choice, and that choice had rewritten everything. Morrison had vanished from the valley, his name whispered in saloons now with disdain instead of fear. But Ezra knew better than to relax. Men like Morrison never stayed buried for long, and they were always more like him. So Ezra didn't rebuild his life in solitude. He accepted Naeli's invitation to visit the tribe's winter camp. He helped rebuild fences not just of wood, but of trust. He sat with Ayanna as the boy learned how to ride again. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, he sat beneath the stars and listened to the rhythm of drums echoing faintly through the hills. A new kind of family. Ezra never married again. He never replaced the hole left by his wife and child. But he did something else, something rarer. He opened his heart. Ayanna became like a second son to him. Not in name, not in blood, but in bond. Naeli, once a stranger in the trees, now visited his homestead regularly, bringing supplies, stories, and news from the mountains. She never said much about her past. Ezra never asked, but over time, their silence grew. Companionable. Sometimes. That's how healing begins. Not in grand gestures, but in shared silence that no longer hurts. Legacy in the land. Years later, long after the valley had settled again, a young rider would pass through that land and ask the locals about the old cabin by the creek. Some would say it belonged to a man who once defied a warlord and lived to tell the tale. Others would whisper about the chief who left behind an eagle feather at that cabin's door every winter, an unspoken sign that peace still held. But the truth lived in the eyes of Ayanna, now a leader in his own right, who would simply say, "That cabin is where a bridge was built. Between two worlds, and between two hearts." Final reflection. The takeaway: courage is rarely convenient. It's rarely rewarded the way we expect. But when we stand up for what's right, when we put ourselves between harm and the helpless, we plant seeds that may grow into something far beyond us. Ezra Whitlock didn't think he'd change the world. He just refused to let it destroy a boy. And in doing so, he didn't just save a life. He inherited a family, he earned a future, and he gave the valley a story worth remembering.